So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a lovely break. We're going to commence this session with a paper entitled Fostering Emotional Immediacy Using Narrative Frame in the Presentation of Historical Musical Works. Before we go to the presentation, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of the Gadigal people, and on behalf of everyone in this room, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I'll just read out the introductions for the two people presenting today. We have Associate Professor Jonathan Paget, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly, and who is Associate Dean for Research at the Western Australian Academy for Performing Arts, Edith Cowan University. He is an acclaimed performer. He also leads the classical guitar program. Jonathan's research has explored Sculthorpe, Australian guitar, historical performance, and the romantic guitar, including performance on period instruments. And he'll be joined by Stewart Smith, who is a senior lecturer and acclaimed organist and harpsichordist who regularly appears with leading Australian ensembles. His discography includes a widely acclaimed 5-CD set of French Baroque music for ABC Classics, while his current research focuses on English Bach reception. Stewart regularly performs on romantic keyboards from WAPA's extensive historic collections. Please make them welcome.
Anxieties surrounding the economic and cultural decline of classical music have been articulated for several decades. For instance, Kramer's monograph, Why Classical Music Still Matters, begins with this alarming précis. What can be done about the state of classical music? In recent years, it has sharply declined in popularity and cultural authority. The prospect of its slow disappearance is no longer unthinkable. However, as Richard Taruskin's review of Kramer's book demonstrates, it is disconcertingly difficult to mount a defence of classical music without perpetuating outdated elitist attitudes regarding the supposed superiority of the genre. At least one thing seems certain: classical music is unlikely to reach wider audiences unless it changes and adapts. A pivotal issue is that historical works speak a half-dead language, with layers of meaning apparently lost in translation. Rife with forgotten subtexts, they present a complex tapestry of semiotic referencing and formal rhetoric opaque to many modern listeners. However, in a postmodern era that recognises a multiplicity of interpretative pathways, the door is open to new creative avenues. This paper proposes the addition of a narrative frame to create dramatic scenes in which music is paired with dramatic readings. This is one strategy that can have surprisingly far-reaching effects on the quality of the audience experience, as well as the performances. To fully grasp the relevance of this approach, epistemological concerns at the heart of classical music performance need to be unpacked. As far back as 2007, in the article Compositions, Score, Performances, Meanings, Leech-Wilkinson critiques the notion of a musical work having an inherent character, ultimately describing this as delusional. His beef is not only with privileging musical scores, but also with the rigidity of HIP exponents, particularly at the time, in propagating the idea of there being an ideal or correct performance in line with the composer's intentions. I quote, "While it, HIP, recognises that performance practices changed and the music sounded and felt different in the past, its solution is to get back to it and tie it permanently to the score. In other words, to outlaw change in interpretation and meaning. Contrary to the claim that pieces work best in their original performance style, recordings show us that they work in an amazing range of performance styles, which again strongly suggests that their notes limit the possible meanings far less than we have supposed." He goes on to propose a model for the creation and transmission of musical meaning as follows in this diagram. Left of the double line represents performance in its historical provenance, and right of the double line represents modern recreation. And the only real constant on both sides is the musical score. The double line is compared to Lethe, one of the rivers of hell in Greek mythology, representing forgetfulness. It is, in other words, an impassable divide, in that the modern musician can never know with any surety what historical performance was like. Rather, they can only interpret and realise musical performances considering their own modern understandings. In Leech-Wilkinson's view, there is no correct, quintessential or ideal performance, and when performers suggest otherwise, they deceive themselves. So where does this leave the endeavour of historical performance? Is it anything goes? While there is nothing unethical with a deliberately anachronistic reading, acknowledging interpretative multiplicity does not necessarily relegate HIP inquiry to a futile exercise. On this point, Leech-Wilkinson arguably goes a step too far. He is undoubtedly correct, however, to locate the musical surface, not larger structures, as the principal location of musical meaning, pointing to research suggesting that the same musical phrase can communicate different meaning if performed differently, regardless of what meaning theorists might assume is implicit within the notes. An array of evidence is assembled showing how performance styles have drastically changed over time, and how these changes can often upend musical meaning. But despite the numerous examples provided by Leech-Wilkinson, the suspicion remains that there might be other examples that could be cited where HIP inquiry equally could lead to increased certainty and consensus. Ad hoc evidence can never convincingly rule out the possibility that a deeper understanding of the notes and performance style can legitimately delimit musical meaning. The problem is that historical music and performance styles are not simply a half-dead language, they also constitute imprecise ones. In lay terms, there were multiple possible interpretations of Schubert, even in Schubert's day. Nevertheless, a softer rationale for the application of HIP knowledge is arguably more palatable, one that acknowledges that HIP knowledge can provide significant signposts to musical meaning, whilst recognising that it can also draw attention to multiple possibilities. In recent years, there has been increasing recognition of distributed creativity in conceptions of music and musical works, one that gives greater recognition to the agency of the performer. Nicholas Cook, in Music as Creative Practice of 2018, succinctly describes the performance of historical music as a collaboration between the living and the dead. This philosophical shift towards recognition of performer agency is ultimately welcome news, opening scope for innovation and variety. Indeed, there are numerous potential ways in which the somewhat tired format of the classical concert might be reinvigorated. It is not difficult to mount arguments as to why communication is a big problem in classical music. Whilst music perception studies demonstrate convincingly that listeners can identify basic emotional states, this seems scarcely enough. But we must tread carefully to avoid regurgitating the old elitist arguments in defence of classical music regarding the presentation of larger structures, the sublime, high art, and so forth. Perhaps these objections can be sidestepped by simply saying that modern audiences sometimes need a little help. The addition of a narrative frame can be a valuable strategy in this regard, enriching the audience experience considerably while simultaneously having a curious effect on the performers. By way of illustration, several examples are offered from recent performance projects at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts. Jane Austen's Drawing Room constituted a program for square piano, guitar and voice, interspersed with readings performed by a WAPA acting student. The text excerpts were extracted from Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice and constituted a heavily condensed version of the plot, retold through key scenes, as shown in the slide. From the audience perspective, the benefits might be self-evident. This strategy turns the concert experience into a dramatic one. Here's a short excerpt from Scene 1, where Krufner's Serenade Opus 55 seems a fitting match for the domestic concerns of the Bennet ladies.
A single man of large fortune, born
Arguably, the success of this formula owes much to the recent commercial successes of period films where modern audiences have been conditioned to hear historical music. Even though the readings were presented alongside the music rather than simultaneously, the matching of drama and music invites the listener to hear the musical works in particular ways, significantly colouring their perceptions. For example, in the scene An Unwelcome Proposal, the ridiculousness of Mr. Collins as a character, his awkward, fawning and pompous nature are left very much in the audience's mind as they begin to listen to the opening of J.C. Bach's F major piano duet, Allegro. Suddenly, the very artificial and mannered nature of the musical figures takes on a comic dimension that might not have previously been present. And the performers appear to deliberately toy with this notion with trills of exaggerated length and seriousness. Indeed, the rhetorical unfolding of sonata form seems a fitting allegory of Mr. Collinson's proposal, which unfolds with the verbose formality of one of his sermons. And I won't play the excerpt for lack of time, unfortunately. Curiously, the dramatised context also opened the potential for the programming of somewhat ephemeral works that we might otherwise have been reluctant to program, acting as a force in resisting the canon. Indeed, much of this concept constituted music intended for domestic music making. For instance, we might easily have dismissed a work like Schultz's Brilliant Waltz as mere trivial ephemera, but in the context of the drama it was highly appropriate and effective. Its playful rhythms and somewhat repetitive leaping melody were no longer trite, but seemed perfectly apt, as the audience placed themselves in the bustle and colour of
a single man of large force. A ball was at any rate a ball.
I only took the last few seconds of that. In the act of assembling a musico-dramatic event such as this, musicians essentially became both dramaturgs and curators. They are dramaturgs in the sense, as described by Boris Plotnikov, that musical dramaturgy opens a way to construct bridges leading to extra-musical fields of association, unquote. And curators in the sense that they must carefully select and match music and text, choosing musical works of a closely associated character to each scene. The process relies on the performers being able to quickly ascertain the hermeneutic possibilities of individual works as a volume of music was screened for potential consideration, arguably leveraging off the performer's extensive experience in historical styles and tropes. Intriguingly, this process often reveals hidden underlying meanings and possibilities beneath previously familiar works. For instance, in looking for a work with military connotations for the scene A Militia Regiment, works with obvious onomatopoeic imitations of drums and bugle calls were examined, particularly chasses, as harbingers of male bravado hunting. The eventual choice, Saw's Grand Solo, contained curious heroic and militaristic tropes that I had never previously noticed in this guitar work, including galloping horses and an ostentatious theme that perfectly matched the swagger of the young officers at Meryton. There is arguably a fine line between the analytical discovery of musical tropes, or signifiers, and the imposition of the musical program. But in this liberating creative process, both are equally permissible. Moreover, the addition of a story arguably has deep historical roots in this period. Recall, for instance, Wagner's reading of Beethoven's String Quartet Opus 131, presenting the image of a day in the life of our hero. So choose your own program. Once the curation and selection of works was complete, knowledge of the intended dramatic context also had a curious effect on the development of the performances. Acutely aware of the intended extra-musical associations, the performers found themselves aiming to bring the intended hermeneutic into sharp relief, often emphasizing or even exaggerating the qualities identified. For instance, in the performance of Diabelli's Grand Sonata in D, first movement for guitar and piano, Stewart and I were inclined to exaggerate the dramatic gravitas of the introduction to suit Elizabeth's strong aversion to Mr. Darcy's marriage proposal in the scene entitled A Violent Rejection.
You could not have made the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. From the first moment of my acquaintance with you, I have been impressed with the fullest belief of your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others. I have not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed on to marry.
In this context, whether the interpretations are historically correct or not becomes less significant. Indeed, the process might even be said to encourage the distortion of the meaning of works towards predetermined dramatic ends. Nevertheless, the performances became more vivid, compelling, and memorable for both performers and audience, despite the imperfections in live performance. The curatorial thinking that the Jane Austen's drawing room concert solicited can also be applied in a more modern context. With the event Earth, Sea and Sky, ostensibly a reference to Sculthorpe, but also a poem, a selection of contemporary Australian works for classical guitar were matched with poems by acclaimed Western Australian poet Glenn Phillips. Phillips subsequently produced a commemorative self-published book based on the event. For this concert, the curation process was reversed. The musical works were selected independently, and then the poet was approached for assistance in the process of selecting matching poems to be read. This was no mean task, given that Glenn has published several thousand poems. Curiously, this reverse curation process forced me to deeply rethink the interpretation of each musical work. In some cases, it considerably and happily altered my understandings of the music and its potential meaning. It is tempting to speculate further regarding the nature of poetry and music as imprecise modes of communication. Oddly, in this medium, it is sufficient for the poem and piece to be merely complementary, I would suggest, rather than a precise match. Side by side, poem and musical work subtly influence each other, like the confluence of two rivers or the interaction of two gravitational fields. The effect is profoundly thought-provoking, but much is left deliberately undefined. In conclusion, it is useful to reflect that the current environment represents a distinct shift from the priorities of the late 20th century modernist performer, to cite Haynes' tripartite division of performance style. For the modernist, the central mission of performance was to create the most accurate, even and perfect reproduction of the score. HRP, at least for much of the late 20th century, was driven by a similarly modernist philosophy in its quest to create or recreate an idealized performance predicated on the composer's intentions. There is now the potential to rescope the central mission of the postmodern performer. One lesson of these creative experiments is to bring a new mission into greater focus. This mission is simple: to develop a compelling and meaningful performance or compelling and meaningful interpretation, authentic or otherwise, and to communicate this to an audience. In this redefined quest, HIP is but one tool at the performer's disposal. Any creative strategy that aids the creation of vivid and compelling hermeneutic readings can be immensely useful, fostering greater emotional immediacy and a revitalized concert experience. Thank you.
So, are there any questions in the room just to get us started? So, Joseph.
Thank you, Jonathan and Stewart, so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I think I'm still collecting my thoughts here, but I found it so interesting, the phrase emotional immediacy. And I think, I guess my thought was that how often we can forget that composers create through the immediacy of an idea, and then often actually don't understand where the source of their own idea. And then as performers, we interpret it with a kind of emotional immediacy as well, and often don't understand our own interpretation. And then the audience receive it with their own emotional immediacy and then have to unravel their interpretation and response. And I think I was wondering to what extent your curatorial decisions were guided by the immediacy of your own emotional responses. So when you would trying to choose a poem to pair with a piece of music, what was it in that instantaneous moment that happened that let you go, okay, this is the right poem for this now? And then what was your process of trying to unravel why you'd made that decision? And then I guess to follow up on that, how did you then undertake this process with the students, and what kind of agency did they have over the creation of the framing as well?
Thank you. I don't know. Oh, very echoey. With regard to the Earth, Sea and Sky concept, is that better? Can you still hear me? Yep. So yeah, I guess the process of choosing poems was kind of a collaborative one between myself and Glenn Phillips, and we did, spend quite a bit of time. And I guess I knew the music. He didn't know the music so much, but I communicated to him. Oh, actually, the way I sort of communicated to Glenn is I told him, I gave him a text accompanying each music, and I said, this is what this piece is about, and these are the sorts of feelings associated with it. So I kind of gave him my reading of the piece of music, and I said to him, can you find poems that match that kind of hermeneutic content? And then he came out with suggestions, and often he gave me multiple possibilities, and often it was pretty, I read the poems and the options, and one just leapt off the page as one that fitted really, really well, and some were more problematic, and I had to go back to him and say, yeah, I don't think either of those are the right fit. Anything else? And we had this dialogue process over several meetings, and I guess once we'd finalized it, we shared it with the only then did we share it with the students. Although no, that's not true. I actually had a draft version that I shared with the students, and sometimes some of them gave me content and they said, oh no, they don't think this particular poem is quite right. And we talked about it in class, and then I went back and had another iteration. So they were involved sort of at the sort of that sort of draft stage. I think I've lost the room audio at this point.
Can you hear
Oh, that's
this
better.
microphone, Jonathan? That's coming through. Okay. I'm just going to jump in with a question about where the project's going now. You've been interacting with spoken text, whether other medium like, I don't know, more sort of dramatic theatrical interactions or dance or other visual medium.
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm very interested in... Oh, I'm getting echoes again. But yeah, I'm very interested in doing some more sort of narrative events to tell other stories. And in fact, I invited Sarah Murphy, who's a colleague at the National Trust here in WA. And we were very fascinated to see some of the performances that connected historic music and place that have gone on in Sydney. I'd like to be able to do something similar with to tell uniquely West Australian stories through colonial era music as well. That's one of the things I'm interested in doing. So that might involve some collaboration with writers or script writers. So yeah, but I would like recreating. Also enjoyed the creation of using existing historical texts. It's just finding the right ones, I guess.
Any other questions? No? Can we thank then Jonathan and Stewart for the presentation? Thank you very much, guys.